My Govanen Melonin, and well met indeed. I'm Arachir Galadirthan, head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, and welcome back to another Divide and Conquer faction lore video. Today, dealing with the High Elves. Now before I begin, let me first of all just extend my thanks to Dr. Big Tree, bizarre name, for his support on Patreon, and indeed to all of those who support on Patreon. The list of supporting names is at the end of the video. So as before with Gundabad, this will follow the same setting. We will first of all talk about Tolkien's actual lore setting for the faction and what he's written about them, and then we will discuss what has been changed to make the faction work in Divide and Conquer. Thereafter, however, in a change from the Gundabad video, I will discuss as well, of course, the faction setup, but also I've added a small section for more notable units amongst the faction roster, particularly those that have some sort of lore basis. Not just the faction's best units, but the units that actually are seen somewhere in the story. I also hopefully have changed up the visual slightly this time so that the second part of the video will actually look at the campaign map of Divide and Conquer and won't just be the battle in the background. But the battle will continue for the first part. So without further ado, let's deal with that first part, Tolkien's setting. The story of the High Elves begins with almost the creation of the universe itself. However, we are primarily concerned with their time in Middle-earth, and that begins at the start of the Second Age after the ruin of Beleriand. Before I discuss the history though, let us first start with their name. The term High Elves was a name given to certain elves by the Dunedain, and it was used for those who had come from Valinor. All elves can be broken down into two distinct categories, the Calaquendi, or light elves, and the Morroquendi, or dark elves. The Calaquendi were so named because they had seen the light of the trees and were blessed. The dark elves are named in a literal way. They had never known light, as the world at that time was only lit by the stars themselves, save for those, of course, from the trees, and so these elves were known as dark elves, for they had not seen the bright light of the trees. The trees, I mention here, are Laurelin and Telperion, and they were two enormous magical trees created by the Valar themselves that gave off light and lit up the entirety of Valinor and indeed the shores of Beleriand. They were there before the sun and moon were thought up. All the elves that went to Valinor were known as Calaquendi, but those who had seen the light from the shores of Beleriand were also in that group. And this is where then the High Elf gives a further subdivision. For the High Elves were those who made it to Aman, the continent that Valinor is on, and those who didn't are not called High Elves, despite both being in the Calaquendi. So as I'm saying here, Calaquendi and High Elves are not strictly speaking interchangeable. The High Elves can also be called Amanyar, which is a word that is interchangeable with High Elf, and that just means those of Aman. And both of those names are used later in Divide and Conquer. The end of the First Age of the world brought with it great upheaval and change. The land of Beleriand, primarily detailed in the Silmarillion and wider Tolkien texts, has sunk beneath the sea after a ruinous and destructive campaign against Melkor known as the War of Wrath. In the war, the Valar themselves, along with the hosts of the Vanyar from Valinor, finally brought down Melkor and cast him out into the void. The Elves of Beleriand are therefore forced to flee, and many choose this opportunity to return to Valinor and leave the world to its fate, but a number choose to stay, and they make for Middle-earth. Once they arrive, the Elves create the new kingdom of Lindon, and it is a place of peace and beauty, with many different types of elves now living together in somewhat harmony. But Lindon does not hold all the elves for very long, and many strike out to see the world and find new lands. And chief amongst them are Galadriel, Celeborn, Celebrimbor, Orifer, the father of Thranduil, and of course, possibly Legolas. Nobody really knows when Legolas was born, as Tolkien talks about him very little, so he may or may not have been born in the First Age, or he may well have been born later in Mirkwood itself, we just don't know. The drive to leave Lindon for many of these elves was also in part because of the deep division between the Sindar and Noldor elves, and many could not live side by side with the other owing to deeds done in the First Age. But some do, and those that remain do so under the watchful eye of the relatively new-come High King, Gil-galad, and his two most prominent advisors, Celebrimbor and Círdan the Shipwright. After the never-ending wars and skirmishes of the First Age, peace comes to the High Elves in the Second. They thrive in Lindon and in its sister realm of Eregion for over 1,000 years, and a strong bond is made between the realms of Lindon and of Númenor. But Melkor's chief lieutenant would soon set in motion his own plans for world domination, and these would include the Elves. In the year 1000 of the Second Age, Sauron, taking the form of a fair and beautiful elf named Anatar, comes to the Elves of Eregion, and there he imparts knowledge and wisdom upon them, and teaches them the ways of the Forge in such a way as they had not seen. Through the Elves, Sauron created the Rings of Power, but not all Elves were blinded to his plans, and in Lindon, Gil-galad and Círdan reject his offerings and turn him away. They didn't know that he was Sauron, but they were suspicious of him nevertheless. 600 years later, Sauron finally crafts the One Ring, and Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion know they have been fooled. Galadriel recommends that the elven rings be sent away and hidden, and Celebrimbor agrees. He sends Vilya and Narya to Gil-galad and Círdan in Lindon, and Nenya to Galadriel in Lothlorien. Sauron, seeing that despite his best-laid plans will not overcome the elves through magic or trickery, gathers the full might of his armies and marches on Eriador. In the year 1693, the War of the Elves and Sauron begins. And the war goes very poorly for the elves. Their people are once again scattered across the world, and this time they don't have the proud sons of men to help hold back the shadow. And so Sauron quickly overruns Eregion and destroys the chief city there of Ostin-Edhil. Elrond is dispatched from Lindon at the head of a large army to try and support Celebrimbor's forces, but he is beaten back, and Eregion and Celebrimbor are lost. The survivors of that battle and those of Elrond's host retreat to a small hidden valley north of Eregion, and there, despite the midst of war, is founded perhaps the most famous elven refuge in Middle-earth, Imladris. Sauron continues his march north and brings his armies to the very border of Lindon itself. Defeat seems inevitable for the High Elves and their Sindar companions in Lindon until, finally, the horns of Númenor sound upon the waves, and a host out of the blessed Isle of Elena sails into the Grey Havens. Sauron, not expecting that the Númenorians would come, is utterly destroyed. He himself flees back to Mordor and abandons his armies to certain death. All of Eriador is cleansed by the combined army of elves and men, and the two races fighting side by side in glory once more, just as they did throughout much of the First Age. Peace then comes again to Lindon, but on the back of such sorrow. Eregion is lost, and with it went Celebrimbor and many of the Noldor's finest craftsmen. However, Imladris flourishes, and the elves once again have an eastern outpost guarding over the lands of Eriador. Further, Gil-galad now appoints Elrond, who's now fully come to his manhood, as his second in command, and gives to him Vilya, the Ring of Air. In time, however, the peace is once again shattered. Towards the end of the Second Age, in the year 3319, the unthinkable happens. The great Isle of Elena, home to the kingdom, or some would say empire, of Númenor, is destroyed. Eru Ilúvatar himself opens a mighty fissure in the very foundations of the earth, and Númenor falls within. Upon closing the gap, Eru then changes the world for one final time by making it round, and moving Valinor away from the known world so that only a select few would know how to sail to it hereafter. But not all hope was lost, as 9 stalwart ships were saved from the downfall of Númenor, and the passengers, following their new king Elendil, found the great realms in exile known as Gondor and Arnor. The two realms grow powerful in only 100 short years, but Sauron, thinking that he was rid of men for good, could not abide their existence any longer, and with an overwhelming host he marches on Gondor and takes the city of Minas Ithil. The Gondorians under King Anarion hold on, as Isildur and his family flee to the north to gather aid for the beleaguered southern realm. Aid was to come to Gondor, in the form of the Last Alliance. A vast host of the combined might of the High Elves and the men of Arnor marched on Mordor, and achieved almost total victory. Barad-dûr was cast down, the Black Land was emptied of orcs and treacherous men, and Sauron, long thought the most powerful being of all by his enemies, was killed in physical combat. Sauron, of course, endured. His spirit, long tied to the existence of the ring, and himself a Maiar, fled Mordor and headed east, and there he would remain for centuries as he regained his power. But in that time the elves once again returned to peace, but again that peace came at a very high price. High King Gil-galad was slain in the Last Alliance, along with thousands of elves. And with their loved ones lost, many elves again depart for Valinor in a second wave of those leaving Middle-earth. But for those who remained, Elrond now took up the lordship, but was not crowned as king. He stayed in Imladris ever after, whilst Círdan governed over the elves who stayed in Mithlond, and Lindon itself was virtually emptied, with the elves who remained there moving to the Grey Havens. As the clock then turned to the Third Age, the High Elves slowly fell out of the histories as more and more of them left for Valinor. Despite this, they did have one last gasp of glory before they became little more than counsellors and advisors to the free folk. And their last hurrah comes at the end of the War of Angmar and Arnor. The Angmarim forces, led by the Witch King of Angmar, have finally ground down the once proud nation of Arnor and had recently overrun the last bastion in the north, the city of Fornost-Rhain. The survivors had fled to Lindon and called upon the elves to help, and help they did. In union with an army that had sailed from Gondor, Glorfindel, a mighty warrior of the First Age who had recently returned to Middle-earth, only 900 years prior to the events of the War of Angmar, marched on the armies of the Witch King, and together they wiped the blight from Eriador. Just as the Elves and Númenóreans had done before in the Second Age, they once again cleansed all of the land from the taint of the Shadow, and thereafter peace reigned in Eriador, and in this time it was a lasting peace. In these years of peace, however, the remaining High Elves finally left for Valinor, with only a handful staying behind. Guiding the remaining elves and helping where they could were, of course, Elrond and Círdan, stalwart elves who had now lived long and through much. But none had lived through as much as Círdan, for at this time, toward the end of the Third Age, he holds the much-lauded accolade of being the oldest named elf in the whole of Tolkien's writings, as Círdan is said to have awoken at Cuavernon, making him at least 9,000 solar years old by the time of the War of the Ring, compared to Elrond's only 3,000 years. In Divide and Conquer, the story of the High Elves remains virtually unchanged. Elrond and Círdan lead the once powerful nation from their chief holds of Imladris and Mithlond, and they call upon great heroes such as Glorfindel, Elladan, and Elrohir to lead their armies. In building the foundations for the High Elves in a total war setting, however, it was necessary to have people to fight for you, and one key change is made to the story of the High Elves. In the years after the defeat of the Witch King, the High Elves abandoned Middle-earth en masse, with only a small number remaining behind, as I mentioned before. But in Divide and Conquer, they don't. Shortly after the Gondorians return south and the Dunedain are taken into Imladris, Elrond convenes a council in Rivendell, inviting nobles of the Sindar and Noldor and the remaining Dunedain. There, he calls upon his people to stay and fight. Sauron has been a problem for the elves since before Elrond was born, and the power of the elves had never been enough to see the Maiar defeated. What hope could men have against that threat alone, where High Elves had failed before? The council, after days of deliberation, agrees to Elrond's call to arms, and the Noldor and Sindar vow not to leave Middle-earth until they have finally put down their hated enemy. They would not abandon the land to his whims, knowing that without a combined effort, Sauron would not fall. And so, 1,000 years after that vow is made, as the days of the Third Age draw to a close, the elves' forges are burning bright. Stores of arms and armour are brought forth from dusty warehouses, and the people set to training and war once again. Elrond dispatches his sons, Elladan and Elrohir, to work with the Dunedain to protect the lands of Eriador and gather information on the orcs of Angmar and Moria. And to Glorfindel, Elrond asks the greatest task, to head alone into the east and learn what he could of Sauron's power and reach. The High Elves in Divide and Conquer are led by both Círdan and Elrond from Mithlond and Imladris respectively, but despite their co-leadership, the realm's capital is set at Mithlond, as the greatest gathering of the elves resides there by the time of the end of the Third Age. Círdan was famously childless, and so the twin sons of Elrond are set to take up the rule should the two Eldar elves fall. The armies of the High Elves still fight along their traditional tribal lines, with the Noldor and Sindar forming their own distinct battalions. The Noldor, the most powerful warriors remaining in Middle-earth, are still very few, and their units are slow to replenish. Being the craftsmen of the elves, the Noldor are ever called to the hills and mountains where their masonry and crafting can flourish. Whilst the term Sindar has been used for the second group of the High Elves throughout this video, in truth the bulk of their people are known as Falathrim, a subset of the Sindar who have lived all their lives on the coasts of the world. They long for the sea always, and are very gifted sailors. As the army of the elves moved toward Mordor, the Falathrim always found their camps and dwellings along waterways. Whether coastal or river, it matters not. They cannot be away from water for long, lest the yearning within them grow too strong. As is expected of the oldest warriors in the world, whether Sindar or Noldor, the High Elves are generally the best at everything they do. Archers, spearmen, cavalry, and swordsmen, whatever the unit, the High Elves often have the best version of that unit. However, despite their vow to remain in Middle-earth, they are still only a shade of their First Age numbers. And as such, the elves are slow to replenish and costly to call to war. As a High Elf commander, you may find yourself constantly outnumbered by the hordes of Moria and Angmar, but it is not you who should fear. When a single elven warrior can kill hundreds of nameless and useless Snagga, it is only a matter of time before a blade of the High Elves is at the throat of Sauron himself. The Smiths of Eregion. Perhaps the High Elves' most recognisable unit, and the most historied of them all, the Smiths are a very rare battalion. Their numbers are made up from the survivors of the downfall of Eregion, or descendants of those who survived. They march to war in the heaviest armour of the elves, and they wield fierce battle hammers. They will see that justice is done for those who fell to Sauron's treachery over 3,000 years ago. Gil-galad's company. Gil-galad was the last High King of the Noldor, and he had fought from the time of the First Age right through the Second. He was feared in battle, and the sight of his mighty weapon, Aeglos, was enough to send orcs fleeing before him. Such a mighty warrior grew a small following of devoted and loyal elves, and only the finest elven warriors came to fight in Gil-galad's personal entourage. Over time, what was a small gathering of 3 or 4 loyal bodyguards became a small company that would protect Gil-galad where they could. Ultimately, failing in their duty, they vowed to avenge their fallen commander, and now fight beside Elrond to ensure the same fate does not befall him. They are skilled with bow and sword, and man for man are the most powerful warriors remaining in Middle-earth. And so concludes the DaC High Elven overview. Slightly longer than the Gundabad one, I believe. But do leave your thoughts and feedback, if you would, in the comments below. But do note that changes have, of course, to be made to these factions. And while some of you may disagree with the changes we make in these videos, remember that this is all to actually provide some reason as to why these nations exist in a total war setting. And this is the change we've made for the High Elves. A very, very simple one, that basically they're just not leaving Middle-earth, is all this video could boil down to. But I do hope that you've enjoyed it, and until we speak again, dear friends, Nevair Neden Perimad Melonin, and farewell.